Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to have Chris Walker from VoiceScape joining us on this presentation about message content and why that's important to your messaging strategy. Chris is a behavioural science expert, and he's going to help us understand why the content of your message is just as critical as the timing and channel of your message. So just to give Chris a little bit more of a build-up, Chris is the Behavioural Insights Lead at VoiceScape. He has a Master's in Psychology, an MSc in Cognitive and Decision Sciences. And I found out about Chris through myself reading a white paper that Chris had written about how messaging outcomes have been improved through the application of behavioural insights. And so I thought this is really interesting for Ascendex customers. You know, Ascendex is here to provide the channel strategy and ensure that your messages get read. But the other side of that coin is the content of those messages and what levers you can pull to make sure that it's more effective. So myself, I'm the head of marketing at Ascendex, and I'm going to be effectively kind of interviewing Christopher to extract the messages that I think will really help the Ascendex customers drive better value through their messaging strategy. So welcome, Chris, and thank you so much for being here. It's really cool. So without further ado, a quick run through the agenda. We're going to look at what is behavioural science, who's using it in their debt recovery strategy. That's going to be an emphasis that we look at today, but I would say behavioural science, as you're going to see during the course of this presentation, behavioural science is something that could be used in any messaging strategy. Why it's important? Real world examples, and having previewed this, there's some really interesting ones to look at. What can businesses expect from applying these methods to their messaging strategy? How do you get started? A quick look at how this differs in an international context, and a really interesting example to finish about some potential pitfalls that you should look out for and how to avoid them. So as an introduction, over to Chris. If you could give us a background to behavioural insights, that would be fantastic.
Thanks very much, Liz. And just before we dive into explaining what behavioural science is, just like to say thanks very much for this opportunity to talk about a subject matter that I'm really passionate about, but I think that one that should be really helpful for your audience, for your customers and prospective customers. So thanks very much for that. So what is behavioural science? So it's the multidisciplinary study of how people make decisions and behave within complex and nuanced environments where details are really important. It's based on decades worth of research in social and biological sciences, and it helps to create a really comprehensive framework for understanding how we behave. And this provides an evidence-based description of how we really behave. So it replaces the traditional idea of rationality with a much more textured approach that factors in the fact that we do have cognitive limitations. So if we think about how it's used in my particular role, we'll look at realigning organizations' systems, process, practice, and cultures with how we actually process information and how we actually behave. So we'll use behavioural science frameworks, we'll use toolkits and experimental methods in order to improve outcomes and help our customers and ultimately their customers to make better decisions. But also importantly, what we do here is to help build a relationship where both parties feel that they're benefiting from each other.
Yeah. And so, Chris, and I know this will be hard to quantify, in your experience, who is using behavioural science effectively today? What sort of organisations?
So you're spot on, Liz. It's a tough question to nail down and give you an exact number of who's using it and whereabouts it's being used. But maybe a nice sort of analogy is to think about the kind of varied ways in which organisations will leverage behavioural insights and behavioural science. So quite often this will range from a single member of a team who's read the book Nudge and is incorporating some of the principles that they've learned from Nudge into their conversations and into their communications, all the way through to organisations with a strategically embedded behavioural insights unit. So teams that will be running training, they'll be doing evidence building, they'll be doing internal consultancy across the whole business. So if we think about the particular sector that we do most of our work in at VoiceScape, so that'll be local authorities and social housing providers, We see that local authorities have made a concerted effort to aim for that more strategically embedded behavioural insight unit, and they've made a good amount of progress through their industry bodies, especially the local government association. And then on the flip side, we've got social housing associations. And they're probably not as coordinated in their strategy, and they'll probably veer towards that idea of an individual, or maybe one or two individuals who've maybe read Nudge and are trying to incorporate it that way, or have read other behavioural insights communication. But there was actually a recent worldwide study or survey, sorry, conducted looking at the organisations that are using behavioural insights throughout the world. So you can see that for the most part, behavioural insights teams are in for-profit companies, and then to a lesser extent within academic institutions, within governments, and then in not-profit organisations. But we do see that more and more outside of our sector, commercial and consumer organisations are working towards that strategically embedded approach. Financial services being one that are kind of maybe at the forefront of employing individuals and creating in-house teams towards that behavioural insights strategy. Yeah. One thing to consider, and this was an outcome of that worldwide survey, was that there are some organisations that maybe read Nudge and kind of pay lip service to behavioural insights. Yeah. And while it is the case that the survey revealed that some organisations do this, those using behavioural insights in name tend to be the exception rather than the rule. So the outcome of that research showed that nearly 70% of organisations using behavioural insights are testing their own work, which is a good sort of barometer for the reliability. Yeah,
that makes sense.
The other thing to think about is the optimal role of behavioural insights within an organisation is dependent on what they want to achieve and how much resource they've got to implement that behavioural approach. So we can kind of think of it as a kind of the role of behavioural insights being a cascading role. So there's 4 key buckets if we think about it this way. We've got behavioural insights as a problem solver. So looking at existing products and services and how these could be tweaked to align these products and services with human behaviour. So that's your classic nudge approach. And maybe the next step down from that would be or the next step up from that would be the behavioural insights as an evaluator. So once an outcome, looking at the outcome of a product or a process and then evaluating or auditing it for areas in which behavioural insights could be leveraged in the future, and looking for that kind of human centricity within that product or process. And naturally that then, the kind of flip side of that would be to start designing a process from the bottom up, ensuring that it's created with behavioural insights and principles in mind from the beginning. Naturally, this would take the pressure off the first 2 roles because we're looking at a process to start to end rather than just at the end where we can tweak things.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, as you say, is that if it starts as a strategy, you're going to have it rather than a sort of end of the channel tactic, then you're going to have better outcomes.
Exactly, and it kind of epitomizes the role that Stephen Johnson plays at VoiceScape. So he plays the kind of role of the final bucket of behavioural insights as a kind of chief strategist. So Stephen's role within VoiceScape, he'll ensure that all the processes throughout our organisation are viewed through that behavioural perspective. So that's, behavioural insights, empiricism, human centricity, the design principles that go along with that, data science. They're all baked into our operating model.
Cool, thank you. And I did skip ahead slightly, so apologies for that. So my next question, which the slide is somewhat giving away, is Chris, did you get the sense that this is more important now? We are kind of looking at, we're recording this in the middle of a second or in some cases a third wave of a COVID pandemic and the ensuing debt crisis that we're anticipating and in some cases experiencing as a result of that. Do you think that's made this more acutely important?
Yeah, I think for all the reasons you've outlined there, that behavioural science as an approach is really important at the moment. Just to caveat slightly, it is a field that's in its relative infancy, but the underlying principle, which is to understand how your customers think, how they make decisions and how they behave, I think that's something that's always been really important, and the value in having that evidence base to draw from to tackle these problems is key. But you're right, if we think about why it's important now for organisations, especially for organisations that have that debt collection component, I think we can boil it down to a question of what you're trying to achieve with your communication. So the obvious answer is going to be payment. But I think what follows is really what makes behavioural insights important just now. So what is it you're trying to achieve beyond that initial payment? So essentially, are you looking to send out a piece of communication, have a behavioural response from that, and then have nothing to do with that person again? Or are you looking to maintain a relationship with that customer after they've paid?
Right.
So if we think about it from the perspective of social housing organisations, landlords don't want to evict tenants. What they want to do is they want to motivate payment, but they want to ensure that tenants remain a tenant and that they continue to pay after that initial debt has been cleared. So this is a much more complex scenario than if you're just looking to secure payment and then end the relationship with that customer. And ultimately, behavioural science offers an approach, or offers an opportunity to help structure both of those approaches. So it can help inform your messaging in the kind of less complex scenario. But I think it's really important when we think about the more complex cases, because we have to start looking at everything around that messaging too. So I think if we go back to that kind of cascading model, we want to think about, not just tweaking something at the end of a process, but setting up a process that bears in mind that you're going to have multiple touch points with this customer.
This is a relationship, not a one time. In many cases, it's as you say, if you get this wrong early, then you're going to be paying for that poor messaging strategy for the rest of your relationship with that customer, however short that may be.
Exactly, yeah. And of course, it would be totally remiss to not think that the current COVID-19 situation isn't reinforcing the fact that this is really important at the moment. So you mentioned the kind of debt collection crisis and the fact that at the moment we are living during a time of kind of in a harsher economic climate. And as a result of that, we're really looking for a cost saving element to a lot of the messaging that we're applying. There's a plethora of examples across behavioural science research that shows that with minimal cost input, you can have huge cost savings across the messaging. And the other thing to note, of course, is the fact that given this current climate, there's legislative restrictions or there's reactions to the current economic climate that mean that, as you mentioned, this approach has changed towards that longer term engagement, building up that relationship rather than maybe one-off messages. So again, if we just thinking about an example in our sector, landlords have had their enforcement powers restricted. And so they've had to look at other ways to recover debt. And one of the ways that they'll, one of the kind of key ways that they can recover debt out with this sort of enforcement process is the use of repayment arrangements. And that's central to how they work. But not only does this require effective messaging, it requires an understanding of the tenant's situation. It requires the creation of payment plans around their situation, and also the use of commitment devices. So again, it's essentially building up that relationship with the tenant so that they can motivate that ongoing payment. So it's that need for a much more holistic approach to how we're looking at our messaging and what our messaging strategy is beyond the actual nuts and bolts of that particular message.
So your point being that if you can drive early repayment, but a too punitive message early on may mean that you can't repeat that strategy. You're actually going to degrade your ability to engage with a customer if you can't keep crying wolf, so to speak, which is it's a really interesting point.
Yeah, exactly. And it all comes down to. Oh, sorry.
No, go for it, Chris.
it all comes down to what you're trying to achieve, and that's
Yeah,
quite often the first step you need to take is understanding your goal,
yeah,
and then everything else starts to build up from that.
yeah. Because as you say, I mean, in some cases, it might not matter a long-term relationship with the
Mhm,
customer.
mhm.
I mean, it's going to be a minimum number of cases, I would think, but from time
Yeah.
to time, that might be the right approach. I dropped this example in from Science Magazine. It's very recent, as you can see, from October 2020, because I thought it really illustrated what Chris is saying, that that the message content and the message timing is going to drive different impacts. And in this case, this was about people not appearing for court proceedings. So it's a charming example, but what you can see from the example is that they offered, they tried 3 messaging strategies. Their no message strategy was the one which was resulting in quite a lot of people not turning up for their appointments. They had a messaging strategy that was reminded them of the consequences of them not appearing. And then there was one about practically how are you going to get there. You know, it was a plan making strategy. It didn't sound particularly punitive. It was kind of more helpful. And then they had a practice that was a combination of the two. And it was that actually in this example, it was that combination of the two that drove the greatest results. But the point is that they experimented, they tried different things, and nobody's working on what they believe will work. They're allowing the science and the data to drive the messaging strategy. What do you think about this example, Chris?
Yeah, I think it's a really neat example of summarising some of the things I've just said there. I think as well, you point out the fact that they're allowing the evidence to kind of decide the direction they go in terms of the messaging, which is really important because you don't want to spend a lot of resource deciding that you're going to pick one messaging strategy only for that not to actually be the most effective. So it's good to have that. Be able to test it and understand which is the best before you start to scale up. The other thing that's really interesting about this study is the fact that not only have you got different messages, you've got 3 different components in terms of the time in which that message went out. So you've got a week
Yeah.
before, 3 days before, and then a day before. And it just speaks to the fact that when we think about communications, it's not only the message that we want to think about, it's the moment that message is sent out. And then there's also things like the method in which that's sent out. So are you sending text messages? Are you phoning? Are you able to make a face-to-face message? Some context that will be an option for you. So it's everything involved in that whole messaging strategy there.
Perfect. So, Chris, I think what will be super interesting now is if you could run us through some real-world examples of where this has paid off for companies. And I think for most people, this is going to be the most exciting part of this strategy, this particular presentation. So, if I'll put you straight into this and pass over.
Cool, thank you. So I've picked an example that Anglian Water, an example of a randomized control trial they ran in 2018. I've picked it for a few reasons, and we'll kind of go through those, and hopefully it'll be evident. But just to maybe set a bit of background on the situation for Anglian Water, they send out 2 reminders to those who don't pay their monthly water bill on time before they start to issue a notice of court action. So what they were wanting to do is they were looking to improve their collection of debt by incorporating behavioural insights into the design of the reminder letters. So if we think back to that cascading model, that's the idea of that behavioural insights is a problem solver. So they ran a randomised control trial, where they compared their original reminder letters with the new behaviourally informed letters. And what the behaviourally informed letter did was it was the exact copy of the original reminder letter, except for they added in 2 additional sentences, sorry. And those additional sentences said, "We've treated your lack of payment as an oversight. If you do not respond to this letter, we will treat it as an active choice not to pay your bill." And so this was designed around the omission strategy, which is the idea that when we don't act, we maintain our status quo behavior. So in this situation it was not to pay. And generally speaking, we're more motivated to kind of stick to the status quo. But also, we tend to judge less harshly an inaction than we do an active decision. So in this case, we would judge less harshly an inactive decision not to pay than an active decision not to pay. So the reason that this technique works is that the majority of people feel that they'll receive greater punishments when non-payment is framed as an active decision rather than a sort of an omission or a failure to act. So it works on this level, but it also works for a number of other levels. It overcomes our tendency to stick to the status quo, which is generally what we'll do given the opportunity. It also means that if people don't pay, it creates a cognitive dissonance around the idea that they're an honest person. So it reframes that whole situation. So the idea that this is now an active choice not to pay your bill, then you're actively cheating the system, or you're actively being dishonest.
It's remarkable that just stating that it has that impact. That's Please continue, sorry, Chris.
And if we think of that first sentence, so we've treated your lack of payment as an oversight. What this does is it introduces an element of reciprocity. So essentially, it gives them the initial benefit of the doubt. And when someone does us a good turn, we're motivated to reciprocate that and do something good for them.
So a single sentence has managed to pull in cognitive dissonance, the principle of reciprocity, and this whole, if an inactive decision, the status quo is easier to live with than an active. That two sentences, it's deceptively simple.
Yeah, and so obviously the big question is what happened in terms of the results. So the results showed that this omission-based letter was significantly better at getting people to pay on time. So in terms of full payments compared to the control letter, these were increased by 1.3%, and then partial payments by about 2%. Now, those percentages don't seem like much, but when you think about everyone that isn't paying their water on time, and you start to scale those percentages up, it can have a massive impact in terms of the monetary savings and the money that Anglian Water are collecting. So if we look at it from the per household perspective, it's about £4 extra per household because of these two sentences. But then the real take-home message is the fact that if you project those savings across everyone, so obviously this was only run with a sample of people, if you project this across everyone who's not paying, everyone who's missed a payment across a full year, the projected savings are in excess of £800,000 from two sentences.
That's incredible.
And so the other reason I picked this is because this is actually a messaging strategy that's been used in other large trials. So it's been used in the UK for tax credit repayments, and what they saw relative to the original letter that they sent out, the exact same design, original letter, only tweaked these sentences. 11% increase in debt repayment. It was used in Poland in a really interesting study where they used a whole range of behaviourally informed letters, and this was the letter that came out on top in terms of council tax repayments. So there was an increase of 7.1% payment there. And then the other reason I've included it, because it's been used, I think it was this year, in the Dominican Republic for tax repayment as well. But what we saw there was that this message didn't increase the effectiveness when the punishment was made explicit. So if you remember, I mentioned that one of the reasons this works is people think that if they're viewing it as an active choice, there'll be an increase in the severity of the punishment. But what they did in the Dominican Republic was they highlighted what that punishment might be. So when the punishment was public disclosure of information for not paying, there was no effect of that omission framing. However, there was a dramatic increase in effectiveness when the punishment was laid out as a potential prison sentence. so much so that the projected savings were in excess of $100 million.
Wow.
So it's been framed at the moment as the $100 million nudge. But there's a few things to bear in mind with the kind of differences that were going on here. So first of all, we see that in 3 trials there's an effectiveness from this letter, from including these sentences, and then in another we don't see that effectiveness. And one of the things to think about was the fact that in the Dominican Republic trial, that those sentences read, bear in mind that providing inaccurate information in the tax return might not be considered as an oversight, but as a voluntary choice. So I think there's a few things we can take away from the fact that that's not quite as explicit. It's a little bit more of a kind of complex sentence. There's a few qualifiers. Bear in mind, inaccurate information might not be considered, voluntary choice. Subtle difference in the framing of that, and that the effectiveness just wasn't there unless you had that quite severe punishment aspect. And there was also the fact that compared to the Anglian, the UK tax credits in the Polish study, they knew how much money that person owed, whereas in Dominican Republic there was ambiguity around how much money a particular person owned, so it wasn't quite as clear what the kind of the value was there. So there was the perception that you might get away with it because it wasn't quite as clear cut. But it just highlights the fact that I think you were about to take the words out of my mouth.
Yeah, so basically, because you don't have the specific circumstances around that customer, because it was the full Dominican Republic, you have to kind of up the ante on the punishment, so to speak, because you can't kind of create a personalized communication plan based on that specific person's examples. So is that what we're saying here? Is though in that case, because we couldn't be more direct about the message, we have to be more punitive in the consequences.
I think that was the one of the insights drawn from the fact that why it wasn't effective without that increase in punitive.
Makes a lot of sense.
Punishment. Yeah.
And to your next example, which I think is a housing association, right?
That's right, yeah. So one in Manchester is a housing association based in Manchester. We worked with them a few years ago, and I'm highlighting this example because we ran a number of randomized control trials with them looking at their messaging. But I wanted to highlight the fact that, beyond what we did in terms of the randomized control trials, we then embedded the thinking from those trials and the insights that we learned and the data that we got from those trials into their service delivery going forward and into different services within the organization. So the idea being that, we like this idea of before and after and what happens, and it's really nice to see the results. But there's also something about the fact that there's a before and after in terms of a change in mindset and a change in practice within the organization. And what we really want to do is to instill the idea of testing within the organization, the sort of the process as well as the actual nuts and bolts of changing the messaging. It's about having that mindset and the process to kind of view behavioural insights as an application that looks at kind of all the aspects of the service rather than just the two sentences at the end of the letter.
Yeah, brilliant. And so what can businesses, on this call, we're going to have everyone from debt collection agencies through to housing associations with debt purchasers and loan providers and housing, local governments in between. What can businesses so disparate expect from applying a messaging strategy like this?
So I think what you'll expect will be a function of what your goal is going to be. So firstly, you need to know what you want from an engagement with a customer. You need to be able to translate that business goal into behavioural action. And then it's about how you're going to leverage that behavioural action. So we can think of a scale that looks at a relational interaction or relational engagement with a transactional engagement. So this is a continuum, and at each point on this continuum, the kind of it relates to what you're looking for from that engagement with the customer, and that will set some of the expectation that you would get from applying behavioural insights. So if we think back to what we were saying about the idea of, if you're just looking for that short-term, one-off engagement, then potentially having that enforcement-based message might be worthwhile. But if you're actually going to have those multiple interactions with someone, and there's maybe potential of less likely to churn, or they don't have as many market options, then that initial enforcement message might not be the most optimal first message to use, because you might want to build up some trust there.
Okay.
We can also think about what you're going to get, what you might expect to get in terms of kind of 3 buckets. We've got engagement. So most messages are designed to secure some sort of engagement. If that engagement's a payment, that's still an engagement to a degree. So we want to think about what we can get there, and generally speaking, simplifying the message is it would be my number one piece of advice in terms of what you want to do to start with behavioural insights, would be to simplify. We quite often think of behaviour change being a bit of a push. The whole idea of nudge is that idea of push. But if we can strip back to the bare minimum, think about design principles within, if it's a written piece of communication, we want to allow the person to understand what they need to do, and then be able to action that in the least amount of steps as possible.
Easier said than done, right? Because that kind of getting to the kernel of what your messaging is really trying to achieve.
Often
there's not that many people doing this right.
And you're right, it's a really difficult process. It's one of these things that you think might be quite easy to strip everything back, and quite often I think we're motivated to feel like we've created something that's really clever, or really gets to the point. An actual fact is that furthering our behavioural goal here, and quite often stripping away all jargon, making it just as simple as possible is going to motivate that behavioural. So the other bucket to think about would be efficiency. So we've mentioned the fact that 2 sentences can have massive impacts. So that's another thing to expect, is if you start to use this properly, you're going to see that it doesn't take much in terms of a resource input for a large resource output. And then obviously the last bucket that goes along with that is the effectiveness. So if you are honing in on the kind of the right areas, then you can expect the behaviour levers that you're going to use to drive better outcomes. So that's going to be better outcomes for the business, but most likely it's also going to be better outcomes for your customer as well. And this all kind of funnels its way down to what we like to call a tailored and targeted approach. So a one-size-fits-all communication approach is unlikely to resonate with all your customer base. So it's about looking at particular areas of your customer base that you feel might be receptive to this message, or might drive an efficiency gain if you target them, or might be the best type of customers based on the behavior that they're showing for a particular campaign strategy, and then tailoring that message to fit what it is you're looking to drive at that point.
Makes sense. And I think, go on. Sorry, Chris.
Well, just to highlight that last point, is the fact that one thing to expect is that it will be challenging. I think the example from the emission study showed that there's quite often very subtle nuances and changes of context that will make something that seems so applicable to your situation not actually quite as applicable as you think it would be. And there's also the fact that when we think back about the what you want to achieve in terms of that relational transactional engagement style, we've got the fact that if you're thinking about this from a long-term perspective, certain techniques won't be as effective long term. So it's a complex environment in which to work.
But the reward's there. Yeah, the reward's there if you put the effort in.
Yeah, exactly. The reward's there, and the whole idea of testing is to iterate on your thinking. So you might not get it right straight away, but it's a process.
Yep. And so, in terms of how the sort of average size business gets started with this, where would you go with this?
So I think the obvious start is to start small. So begin with really tactical pilots with the idea of creating proof points. But ultimately you want to sit this within a wider ambition for strategic integration. Not only will this encourage stakeholders to think big while offering that low risk, low cost experiments that validate your approach, but the idea being that this is really good because you want to make sure that that is validated before you introduce, before you have to implement significant investment, or before there's that disruptive change that's required. So start with those quick wins.
Yeah.
And you know, whilst they're quick wins, the importance here is to make sure that you're doing this rigorously enough so that you're building that evidence base. So you want to kind of look at clean randomized control trials. So one of the things that quite often we want to do when we think about designing a new letter, for example, is we've got that original control letter. Let's change everything because I can see where it's all going wrong here. But one of the downsides of that is that it's very hard to understand what changes made that difference. So starting small with just changing one or two features, and then if there's no difference there, you can start to change other things. But it's building up that evidence base. And the other thing to think about in terms of how organizations can get started is to think about the kind of the fact that whilst randomized control trials, they're quite simple in structure, it belies the great depth and the technical complexity that goes into their design and their analysis. And it means that you can have a bit of a false confidence if you've got a bit of a do-it-yourself randomized control trial that aren't really set up to deliver that reliable evidence or learning. And the risk being there that you've got a kind of a small pilot, you kind of believe that that's a good evidence base to scale up and roll out that intervention, only to then realize that it's got a negative business impact when the performance is and they're kind of not operating at scale. The other thing in terms of getting started is there's such a good amount of information out there in terms of behavioral science frameworks that will help you to structure that design of changing communication. So we've got frameworks like Mindspace and EAST that were introduced by the behavioral insights team. And then there was a more recent framework called Inspire, which has been used to help written requests using behavioral insights techniques. So these are a really good starting point for building up that confidence to redesign these letters and to introduce behavioral insights.
Great, and I think so for people watching the webinar, we will make sure that you get the links to those frameworks. They're not included in the presentation, but we'll make sure we distribute the links. And so, Chris, I think I probably already know the answer to this, but how might tactics differ from country to country? I think you've probably already you're going to tell me it's context, I suspect.
Yeah, I've probably bored everyone to tears now about the fact that I've mentioned context so often, but yeah, context is key. And so obviously if we're looking internationally, then context is likely to change more dramatically. Now, context will obviously change within a country, within different regions of a country, we can change quite rapidly. But at that international level, that difference is likely to be more enlarged. So I'll give you a quick example of an anecdote I heard that kind of highlights the differences from a kind of cultural perspective. So this is to do with an English and Irishman who go to the horse racing and place a bet on a horse, and it's supposed to highlight the difference in the impact of the endowment effect, which is the idea that we value things more if they belong to us. So an Englishman and an Irishman, they both go to the races, they both place an equivalent bet and they win £1,000 in their respective currencies. They then pocket that original bet, so they're evens for the day, and then they invest the gains, that £1,000, back into the new bet. They then both subsequently lose that bet, and they're going home at the end of the day. And the Englishman's depressed because he feels like he's lost £1,000. But the Irishman feels pretty indifferent because he feels like he's neither gained nor lost. So the suggestion here being that Irish people are less subject to the endowment effect than English people. It's just a bit of an anecdote. I'm not sure how true it is, so no one quote me on that. But it just highlights that in a kind of a caricature example. But when we think about internationally, obviously we've got language, for example. So even if we think about, masculine and feminine words, so research has shown that these words are often associated with, typically masculine or feminine qualities. So that's got obvious implications if we're translating findings from English-speaking countries to, say, Italy or Germany.
A non-gendered language to a gendered language could be fraught with potential pitfalls, right?
Definitely. And also between two gendered languages, because it might be the case that a feminine word in Italian is actually a masculine word in French. And so the associations that go with that then might change, and if we're using it in a context, it could change, it could colour the perception of what that message is saying. And then obviously, if we think of an example of culture, just to kind of reiterate the fact that culture provides context for pretty much everything we do, and it's going to vary quite a lot. But a kind of a neat example of this is the idea of cognitive dissonance. So I mentioned that from the emission study, that was one of the levers that helped motivate that payment in that study. So this is the well-studied phenomenon that people who feel psychologically uncomfortable if their behaviours deviate from their attitudes and their self-identity. But in more collectivist cultures, people's attitudes don't define their self-identity to the same extent as in individualistic cultures. So therefore, behavior that goes against their attitudes generates less dissonance. So we wouldn't expect, say, the cognitive dissonance lever within the emission study to have as much impact in a collectivist culture as it would in an individualistic culture.
Wow. And so just to sort of round us off then, could you talk us through an example of where, I think knowing the example already, I know what went wrong, but it's kind of all about not going into this with your instincts, or it's about following the data. But I'd love you to talk us through this story because I think it's fascinating.
Sure, yeah, of course. It is a really nice study, and I think it's got a lot of good takeaway messages from it. So this was a question that Liz asked about being surprised about the result of a particular messaging strategy, and why I was surprised about this. So we did some work looking at arrangement payments, and we looked at the impact of personalizing the message that you send to customers. So the idea being that personalizing involves humanizing that piece of communication to demonstrate or create a sense that there's an exchange between two people, not necessarily an exchange between a person and an organization. So it attempts to remove that power structure and the perceived difference between the person and the organization. So we also looked at this from the perspective that social housing organisations use a lot of standard computer-generated communications, so the potential to increase those human touch points and to cut through and create that kind of personalised feeling was high, in addition to the fact that we'd done qualitative research which suggests that, tenants felt that the communication was impersonal and cold. So we took everything that we learned directly, and then we looked at the fact that previous research suggested that more personalized messages will impact the behavioral outcome that you're looking for. So we decided to test this with a randomized control trial. We had 3 components. So we had the standard letter, so there was no personalization in that. And then we had the first personalized letter. So this was quite simple. It remained very similar to the control group, but what it did was it included the recipient's first name, and it was just a little bit more conversational in the tone. And then we looked at the wider research and saw that Handwritten letters were they were seen to increase that sense of personalization because someone's taken the time to, get out a pen rather than type on a computer and write out this letter to you. So we looked at that, and then we added an extra element on top of that and introduced this idea of thanking the tenant for making that repayment. So that was our three arms of the trial. So looking at the results, we found that the simple personalized letter performed better than the control to a statistical extent, but completely unexpected to us, the handwritten letter performed markedly worse than the control. So we couldn't quite understand at the time why this was the case. This was the one that we expected to be by far and away the best outcome. So because we wanted to understand what was going on there, we did some follow-up qualitative research to find out what customers felt about this letter. So what they told us was that the handwritten letter was suspicious and that it lacked a feeling of authenticity. Essentially, it was over the top for the behavior that they were supposed to be carrying out. It just didn't sit with them quite right. And what this meant was that we thought it was going to increase the amount of trust between the organisation and the tenant, but in actual fact, it questioned that trust. There was a feeling of it being disingenuous. This was a behaviour that, because it was a repayment arrangement, they were committed to making payments time and time again, and the over-the-top thank you for making a payment at that particular time just didn't make sense. Yeah. So it's a really nice example of how this is a complex environment to work in, and how the subtleties and nuances of the context and the whole process can really change the outcome of the result. But it's quite nice because it's humbling in the sense that you feel like you've got a hold of what's going on. You create this intervention and it doesn't go how you expect. It's really good from a learning perspective, but it's also good just to highlight the fact that you're probably not going to get this right every single time, because sometimes there's things that we just haven't factored in that are actually more important than we think. And it really reinforces, again, sorry to everyone, that context is key, but also not to necessarily just pick up what someone else has done and try it yourself. It's maybe to think about that a little bit more before you just pick it up and do it yourself, and obviously to test these things, because then you can build up your own evidence base for your own customers, which is really important.
So thank you, Chris. I mean, for me, that was genuinely really, really interesting. And I hope for the Ascendex customers who are listening to this, that it's opened up some areas of inquiry that maybe you're not thinking about today, maybe you are, and you could do with some strategic help there. The VoiceScape team, this is obviously what they do for a living, right? So if you do need help with that strategy, I would strongly recommend giving Chris and his team a call, and the contact details are on your screen just now. It partners beautifully with Ascendex. We're about the messaging channels and the timing, and we can assist with all of the right things to help those messages get delivered. And the VoiceScape team can help you get those messages absolutely on point. And if nothing else, just give you the frameworks to help you explore this venture yourself. So thank you again, Chris. Really, really interesting. And if anybody has any sort of feedback or questions, please get in touch with myself or Chris. I'm sure we'd both be really happy to help. Any final words, Chris?
Yeah, just to say thanks for that. Really appreciate, being able to have the platform to discuss something that I'm clearly very passionate about. But also because I hope that this gives your audience something to think about in terms of their messaging strategy, and hopefully they've benefited from it. And as you say there, the messaging, the method and the timing, that's crucial as well. So bringing that together with the actual content of that message is just a really nice way to round off that messaging strategy. So thanks very much for that.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody.